The first plank came up from Walter Thompson's cabin floor on November 3rd, 1996. And that's when the talking started. Winter pressed down on Duluth like a silent god, and Lake Superior's wind moved through the streets with teeth. Walter Thompson arrived the way tired men often do, without ceremony, without witnesses who mattered, and without anything left to prove. His pickup truck crawled up the icy road at the edge of town, tires crunching over old snow that had hardened into something like bone. The cabin waited there, a weather-worn wooden box hunched among bare trees, its paint faded, and its porch leaning as if it had grown weary of holding itself upright. Walter cut the engine and sat still for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, his breath fogging the windshield. He wore the same thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket he'd worn in the last photograph anyone bothered to take of him. The kind of jacket that looked less like clothing and more like armor you could still swing an axe in. His face was long and weathered, with deep-set eyes the color of river stones, and a jawline that had once been sharp but had softened with age into something patient and stubborn. A short gray beard framed his mouth, trimmed not for style but for practicality, and the skin on his knuckles was split and scarred in the way hands become when they've spent decades fighting cold metal, rough rope, and harder luck. He looked like a man built out of winters. Beside him, Rex shifted in the passenger seat with the slow control of a trained animal that had learned to wait until the human decided the moment was safe. Rex was a full-grown German shepherd, about 5 years old, thick through the chest and shoulders, with a black saddle of fur across his back, and tan legs strong enough to carry him through deep snow without hesitation. His ears stayed upright like antennae tuned to danger, and his amber eyes tracked everything outside the window branches, shadows, the faint movement of a distant squirrel without a flicker of panic. There was a scar near his left ear, a pale line hidden under fur, and Walter had never explained where it came from. The dog didn't whine, didn't bark, didn't beg. Rex carried himself like a quiet sentry who had accepted the world was unpredictable but believed his job was to stand between it and the man he'd chosen. Walter opened the truck door and stepped out. The cold slapped him awake, the kind of cold that doesn't just touch skin but tries to enter memory. He stood there and listened. Duluth wasn't fully silent. Nothing near a great lake ever truly is, but it had that winter hush, that muffled stillness where even the smallest sound feels too loud. The wind ran through the pines and the bare branches like an old warning. Walter inhaled and tasted snow coming. He didn't come here for scenery. He came here because Duluth was the kind of place that didn't ask too many questions if you kept your yard clean and your mouth shut. He came because the cabin was cheap, and cheap things were often the only things left for men like him. He came because the lake was honest about what it could do to you. Some places lied with sunshine. Duluth told the truth in frost. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of damp wood, old smoke, and time. Walter set his duffel bag on the floor, and Rex padded in behind him, nails clicking softly on the boards. The living room was small, with a stone fireplace that had been patched and repatched, a narrow window that looked out toward the trees, and a floor that creaked as if it wanted to complain. Walter moved through the space like a man mapping a battlefield. He checked corners, tested the door lock, looked up at the ceiling for leaks. His mind had a habit of scanning for problems before it allowed itself to feel anything else. That habit wasn't born from paranoia. It was born from surviving. Years earlier, when Walter was younger and still believed the world ran on rules, he'd served in the army and learned how quickly order could collapse. He'd learned that the worst moments weren't always loud. Sometimes they were quiet. A wrong turn, a late radio call, a split second of doubt. The kind of moments that left you alive but not entirely whole. After he came home, people expected him to be grateful, to be proud, to be normal. He tried. He held jobs that didn't fit him, stood in lines that made him feel trapped, smiled at conversations that felt like foreign languages. Over time, he learned the safest way to exist was to become small. Not weak, never weak, but quiet. Quiet meant fewer questions. Quiet meant fewer invitations to disappoint people. Rex was the one creature who never asked Walter to explain himself. Walter had found him at a shelter 2 years earlier. A big dog that no one wanted because he was too intense. Walter recognized that intensity. It wasn't aggression. It was vigilance. It was the refusal to pretend the world was harmless. Walter signed the papers without hesitation. The shelter worker, a woman with tired eyes and a gentle voice, had warned him the dog might not adjust easily. Walter had simply nodded, because he understood. Some souls didn't adjust. They adapted. The first night in the cabin, Walter didn't sleep much. He lay on a thin mattress in the back room, listening to the building settle and the wind circle the walls like a predator testing for weakness. Rex lay near the door, head on his paws, breathing slow and steady. Walter watched the rise and fall of the dog's ribs and felt something like peace trying to approach him, cautious and unfamiliar. He didn't trust it. Peace, for Walter, had always been temporary. Morning came gray and sharp. Walter brewed coffee in an old dented pot and drank it standing by the window. Snow drifted in small spirals, as if the sky was practicing. The forecast on the radio spoke in calm numbers that didn't match the way the air felt. Walter had lived long enough to know winter didn't always announce itself honestly. Sometimes it smiled first. He spent the day doing what he always did when he felt the world tightening around him. He worked. He cleaned out the fireplace, hauled in the few pieces of wood left behind by the previous owner, and inspected the exterior of the cabin. He found gaps in the siding where wind could slip in, and he stuffed them with insulation and old cloth. He checked the roofline and the gutters. He didn't do these things because he loved the cabin. He did them because survival was a language he still spoke fluently. In the afternoon, as Walter was stacking a small pile of wood near the porch, a voice called out from the road, "You the new guy?" Walter turned slowly. A man stood by a pickup truck parked crookedly near the edge of Walter's property. The man looked about 55, broad-shouldered and thick around the middle, with a ruddy face that suggested he'd spent years outdoors and a mustache that was more habit than style. He wore a brown work jacket stretched tight across his chest and a knit cap pulled low. His eyes were pale blue and sharp with curiosity. He had the posture of someone who believed he had a right to speak first. "Name's Gary Whitman," the man said, stepping closer without waiting for permission. His boots were crusted with snow and road salt. "I live down the way. Figured I'd come see who bought that place. Been empty a while." Walter didn't offer his hand immediately. He watched Gary the way he watched weather carefully, without drama. Then he nodded once. "Walter Thompson." Gary glanced at Rex, who stood beside Walter like a shadow with teeth. "That's a serious dog." "Rex," Walter said, voice flat. Rex didn't bark. He simply stared, ears forward, body still. Gary's smile tightened. He tried to act like he wasn't intimidated, but his shoulders lifted slightly, the way people do when they're suddenly aware of their own vulnerability. Well, Gary said, clearing his throat, you picked a hell of a time to move in. Winter's gonna be nasty this year. Folks are saying we'll get one of those lake effect monsters. Walter returned to stacking wood. Winter's always nasty. Gary laughed, the sound too loud for the quiet afternoon. Sure, but there's nasty, and then there's Duluth nasty. You got enough wood? You got a plan? Walter paused and looked at Gary, and for a moment something old flickered behind his eyes. An irritation, maybe, or a memory of being questioned by men who thought authority lived in their tone. He kept his voice calm. I'll manage. Gary seemed to accept that as a challenge. You don't talk much, do you? Walter's mouth barely moved. Not if I don't have to. Gary nodded as if he'd expected that. Well, listen. Folks around here, we help each other when it gets bad. But you gotta do things the smart way. Stack your wood off the ground. Cover it good. Keep it close to the house. Don't be one of those idiots who thinks he can outsmart Superior. Walter looked past Gary toward the lake direction, though he couldn't see it from here. I'm not trying to outsmart anything, he said. I'm trying to prepare. Gary's gaze flicked again to the cabin, to the porch, to the woodpile. You got family coming? No. Wife? Walter's jaw tightened slightly. No. Gary hesitated, and something softened in his face for half a second, like he realized he'd stepped on a sore place. Well, all right. Just you and the dog. Walter nodded. Gary shoved his hands into his pockets. If you need anything, you can holler. I got a snowblower, generator too. Not saying I'm a saint, but I'm not gonna let somebody freeze to death if I can help it. Walter heard the pride in that sentence, the need to be seen as decent. He didn't judge it. He understood it. People needed roles to feel safe. Walter's role for most of his life had been the man who handled his own problems, even when he couldn't. Appreciate it, Walter said. Gary started to leave, then turned back. Hey, you ever been through a real Duluth blizzard? Walter looked at him. I've been through worse than snow. Gary smiled again, but it was uneasy now, as if he couldn't decide whether to respect Walter or dismiss him. All right then. Welcome to the neighborhood, Walter Thompson. After Gary drove away, Walter stood in the yard and watched the tire tracks fade under fresh snow. Rex pressed his shoulder lightly against Walter's leg, a small gesture that felt like a hand on the arm. Walter scratched behind Rex's ear, fingers moving automatically, and exhaled. He didn't like neighbors. Not because he hated people, but because people came with expectations. They wanted friendliness. They wanted stories. They wanted you to be the version of yourself that made them comfortable. Walter had spent too many years trying to perform that version and failing. Inside the cabin again, Walter walked across the living room and stopped at the center of the floor. The boards there looked older, slightly darker, as if they'd absorbed more footsteps than the rest. He stared down at them with the focus of a man reading a map. In his mind, he could already see what he wanted to build, not above ground, but beneath it. A place where firewood could stay dry. A place protected from wind-driven moisture and the cruel trick of thaw-freeze cycles. People thought winter was only about cold. Walter knew winter was about water. Water that seeped, froze, expanded, and destroyed everything careless. He knelt, pressed his palm to the floor, and listened. Not with his ears, but with that strange sense of intuition that comes when a man has survived long enough to trust his own silence. Rex sat behind him, calm and watchful. Walter could feel the dog's presence like a steady heartbeat in the room. He whispered, not to the dog, not to the cabin, but to the part of himself that still needed permission to begin. Not this year. Outside, the wind rose again, and somewhere beyond the trees, Lake Superior moved like a sleeping giant turning in its bed. Walter stood up slowly, the joints in his knee complaining, and looked around the small room that would either shelter him or fail him. He didn't know which yet. But he knew this. He would not be caught unprepared. Not by winter, not by loneliness, not by anything that came quietly and tried to take him while he wasn't looking. Walter didn't wake up to sunlight. In Duluth, winter mornings didn't arrive like a blessing. They arrived like an inspection. The sky stayed the color of old tin, and the wind off Lake Superior moved through the trees with the slow patience of something that knew it would eventually win. Walter sat on the edge of his mattress and listened to the cabin breathe, the walls creaking softly as if the house itself was trying to remember how to stand against cold. Rex lifted his head from the floor near the door, eyes alert but calm, his ears pricked forward like two black blades. The dog's gaze tracked Walter with quiet loyalty, not begging for affection, not demanding anything. He simply waited, as if he understood that today wasn't for comfort. Today was for work. Walter pulled on his thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket, the fabric stiff from the chill, and for a moment he stared at his hands. They looked older than he felt, and he hated that. In the army, he'd learned that time could be survived like any other enemy, one day at a time, one breath at a time. But now, time didn't just chase him. It sat on his shoulders. He stood up anyway, because standing up was what he still knew how to do. He moved through the cabin with deliberate purpose, brewing coffee and swallowing it hot and bitter, then laying his tools out on the kitchen table as if he were preparing for surgery. Tape measure, pencil, crowbar, hammer. A small handsaw with a worn wooden handle that fit his palm like it had been carved for him. Rex followed him from room to room, nails tapping the floorboards, tail low and steady. Walter paused in the living room, at the spot he'd studied the day before. The boards there were older, darker, and they groaned under his weight with a sound that reminded him of tired knees. He knelt and pressed the tape measure down, marking a clean square with pencil lines so straight they looked almost angry. His mind wasn't noisy while he worked. It was quiet in the way a man becomes quiet when he has finally found something he can control. The first plank came up with a sharp crack that echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. Rex flinched only slightly, then leaned forward to look, his nose twitching as cold air rose from the dark space beneath the floor. Walter pried the wood free, set it aside, and stared down into the crawl space. It smelled like earth and old dust, like the underside of forgotten years. Most people would have looked at that darkness and imagined rot, spiders, problems. Walter looked at it and imagined dry wood, steady fire, a winter that couldn't humiliate him. He widened the opening plank by plank, sweat forming at his temples despite the cold, his breath puffing white in front of his face. He worked with the stubborn rhythm of a man who had once dug trenches in foreign soil, who had once built shelter under skies that wanted him dead. This was easier, in a way. This was home, even if home didn't feel like a warm word anymore. By mid-morning, the sound of his hammering carried outside, and the neighborhood began to notice. The first to appear wasn't Gary Whitman. It was a woman from 2 houses down, drawn by curiosity the way crows were drawn by anything new. Her name was Marlene Jacobs, and she walked up the porch steps like she owned them, her boots leaving wet prints on the boards. Marlene was in her early 60s, with short silver hair curled neatly under a knit hat, and a face that had learned to be sharp so the world wouldn't mistake her for soft. Her cheeks were pink from cold, her eyes dark and watchful, and she wore a puffy blue coat that made her look like a bundled-up bird. She carried a paper bag in one hand, and Walter noticed the way she held it out in front of her, as if offering kindness while keeping distance. Rex stood between them, shoulders squared, not barking, but letting his presence speak. Marlene glanced at the dog and raised an eyebrow. "That's a big shepherd," she said, voice dry. "He bite?" "He watches," Walter answered, and that was all. Marlene stepped closer to the doorway and peered inside. Her gaze landed on the open floor and the tools scattered like bones. "Lord," she muttered, "you're tearing the place apart already." Walter didn't stop working. He slid the crowbar under another board and lifted. "Fixing it," he said. He thumped. Marlene let out a small laugh. Not cruel, but amused. The kind of laugh people make when they don't understand something and want to feel smarter than it. "Fixing it by making a hole in the floor?" Walter glanced up at her, eyes steady. "I'm making a trapdoor." Marlene's mouth opened slightly, then closed again. She looked like she was deciding whether to ask or leave. Curiosity won. "For what?" she asked. Walter wiped his forehead with the back of his wrist. "Firewood." Marlene stared at him as if he'd said he planned to store a blizzard in his pantry. "Under your floor," she repeated, slow. Walter nodded once. Rex's ears flicked toward the road, hearing something Walter hadn't yet. Marlene shook her head, smiling now in a way that made her seem younger, almost mischievous. "Honey," she said, and Walter hated the word honey from strangers. "Wood belongs outside. You're gonna make your house smell like a wet campfire." Walter's voice stayed even. "Outside wood gets wet." Marlene lifted her shoulders in a shrug. "That's what tarps are for." Walter's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in memory. He had heard people say, "That's what it's for," his whole life, as if the world always worked the way it was supposed to. He looked back down into the dark space beneath the floor. "Tarp doesn't stop lake wind," he said. "Tarp doesn't stop freeze-thaw. It doesn't stop mold." He paused, then added quietly, "And it doesn't stop a man from running out of options." Marlene's expression softened, just a fraction. She shifted the bag in her hand. "Well," she said, trying to recover her humor, "I guess you'll either be a genius or the strangest fool on this street." She held out the paper bag. "I brought you muffins. Blueberry. You look like you're working yourself into an early grave." Walter hesitated. Accepting kindness always felt like stepping onto thin ice, but refusing it felt like insulting the only warmth people knew how to offer. He took the bag carefully. "Thank you," he said. Marlene nodded toward Rex. "And for him?" she asked, eyebrows raised. Walter almost smiled. Almost. "He doesn't eat muffins," he said. Rex, as if offended by the idea, snorted softly and turned his head away. Marlene laughed at that. A real laugh this time, and it echoed down the quiet street. "All right then," she said. "You do your underground lumber business." She stepped back, then leaned in once more. "But if you fall through that hole and break your hip, don't haunt me. I'm too old for ghosts." Then she left, boots crunching away, her laughter fading into wind. Not long after, Gary Whitman arrived, just as Walter predicted he would. Gary's truck rolled up with a familiar squeal of tires on packed snow. He climbed out wearing the same brown jacket, mustache stiff with cold, and he approached with the confidence of a man who believed he was about to witness a disaster he could later brag about. "I heard hammering," Gary called. "Thought you were either fixing something or losing your mind." Walter didn't answer immediately. He was lowering himself through the opening, careful with his weight, one hand gripping the edge of the floor while his boots searched for stable ground below. The crawl space was tight and bitter cold, but Walter didn't mind. Tight spaces had never scared him. It was open spaces that sometimes made his chest feel too empty. Rex stood at the edge above, peering down, his head tilted, as if he wanted to follow, but understood he was needed as lookout. Gary stepped into the doorway and whistled. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "You really did it." Walter's voice drifted up from below. "Still doing it." Gary leaned forward, hands on his knees, staring down like he was looking into a magician's hat. "You're gonna store wood down there?" Walter's boots crunched on dirt. He reached down and scooped a handful of soil, letting it fall through his fingers. Dry. He felt a flicker of satisfaction. "Not just store it," he said. "Protect it." Gary laughed. "Protect it from what? The boogeyman?" Walter didn't laugh back. He pressed his palm against the stone foundation wall, cold and solid. "From water," he said. "From mold. From being useless when you need it most." Gary snorted. "You're telling me you're gonna outsmart the weather?" Walter looked up through the square of light above him. Rex's face hovered there, framed by floorboards, his eyes glowing amber in the dimness. Walter's voice came out steady, almost tired. "I'm telling you, I'm not gambling with it." Gary's laughter faded slightly. "You always talk like that," he said. "Like everything's a war." Walter paused. The dirt under his boots felt familiar, grounding. "Some winters are," he replied. Gary fell quiet for a moment, and Walter could hear him shifting, uncomfortable with the sudden seriousness. Then Gary cleared his throat and forced humor back into the air, like stuffing into a ripped coat. "So what's the plan, General Thompson?" he asked. "You gonna build a bunker for your firewood? Put little helmets on the logs?" Walter climbed back up, using his arms with slow strength. When he emerged, he looked older in the gray light, sweat darkening the collar of his flannel jacket. He stared at Gary with a flat expression that made it impossible to tell whether he was amused or annoyed. "I'm lining it with stone," he said. "Then straw. Then a wooden cover that seals tight. Dry air. No moisture. No rot." Gary whistled again. "That's a lot." Walter nodded. "Winter is a lot." Gary's eyes flicked toward the open floor again, then toward the rest of the cabin. "People are gonna talk," he said, not warning, almost enjoying the idea. Walter picked up his hammer and tapped it lightly against his palm. "People always talk," he replied. Gary grinned. "True." He stepped back, shaking his head. "Well, I'll tell you what. If this works, I'll buy you a beer come spring. If it doesn't, I'll help you patch the floor so you don't freeze your toes off." Walter didn't answer right away. He looked at the square hole, then at Rex, then out the window where snow was thickening in the air like a curtain being drawn. He could feel winter gathering strength, patient and relentless. He could also feel something else, the strange pressure of being watched, judged, laughed at. That pressure had followed him through life like a second shadow. But this time he didn't feel ashamed. He felt focused. "You can keep your beer," Walter said finally. "Just keep your mouth shut when the cold comes." Gary laughed, but it was smaller now, edged with respect he didn't want to admit. "All right," he said. "You stubborn old bastard." He glanced once more at Rex. "That dog's got your personality, you know." Walter's lips twitched. "He learned from the best," he said. And that was the closest thing to a joke he'd made in years. After Gary left, Walter worked until his arms ached and his fingers went numb. He hauled flat stones from behind the cabin, scraping them clean and setting them carefully in the pit, building a rough lining that would keep the earth from sweating moisture into his wood. He packed straw in the corners, dry and pale like old sunlight, and he tested the fit of the boards he'd removed, imagining how they would sit again as a hidden door. Rex stayed near, sometimes lying down, sometimes standing abruptly when a sound drifted from the road, always returning his gaze to Walter, as if asking one silent question. "Are we safe?" Walter didn't answer aloud, but he kept working, because work was his way of saying yes. As evening fell, Walter stood over the opening and stared down at the dark space he'd carved out. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't something you'd show off. But it was his. A secret beneath his feet. A quiet plan against a loud season. Outside, the wind rose again, and snow began to fall in thicker sheets, covering the world in white as if trying to erase it. Walter closed the trapdoor temporarily with a heavy plank and set a chair over it, not because he feared thieves, but because he feared accidents. He'd learned long ago that danger didn't always come from enemies. Sometimes it came from one careless step. That night, he sat by the fireplace with Rex at his feet, the cabin still cold, but no longer feeling helpless. Walter stared into the small flame and felt something shift inside him, subtle as a crack forming in ice. He wasn't sure if it was hope. Hope felt too fragile, too sentimental. It was something harder than hope. It was resolve, the kind that didn't need applause, the kind that didn't care if the neighborhood laughed. Walter listened to the wind batter the walls and thought of the months ahead. Let them talk, he told himself. Let them laugh. Winter would answer them soon enough. The storm didn't arrive like a surprise. It arrived like a verdict. All afternoon, the sky had thickened into a low, bruised ceiling, and the wind coming off Lake Superior had sharpened until it sounded like something scraping its nails along the side of the world. Walter felt it in his bones before the first heavy flakes hit the porch steps. He stood at the living room window in his thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket, coffee cooling in his hand, and watched the trees bend as if they were bowing to an unseen king. Rex stood beside him, silent, his breath fogging the glass in short bursts, ears angled toward the sound of the lake wind. The dog's body was tense in the way of an animal that didn't fear weather but respected it, the way a soldier respects artillery even when he has no intention of running. Walter's eyes narrowed as the first true gust slammed into the cabin and made the window pane shudder. He didn't flinch. He had spent too many years learning not to flinch. By dusk, snow was falling in thick sheets, not drifting gently, but charging sideways, driven by wind that seemed determined to shove the entire town into the lake. The road outside Walter's cabin disappeared under white within minutes, and the air turned grainy, full of stinging ice crystals that made breathing feel like swallowing needles. Walter moved with the calm efficiency of someone who had already rehearsed this in his mind. He latched the windows, shoved towels against the drafty seams, and checked the fireplace again, clearing the ash, stacking kindling, laying out a neat pyramid of dry splits. Rex paced once, then settled near the hearth, head lifted, watching Walter's hands. Walter could feel the dog's gaze the way he could feel the pressure of a storm. Constant, steady, impossible to ignore. In that gaze was something Walter didn't want to name. Trust. Not the cheap kind people talked about in friendly conversations, but the kind earned in silence. The first power flicker came around 8. The cabin lights blinked once, twice, then steadied. Walter didn't curse. He simply reached for the old lantern he'd placed on the table, checked the batteries, and set it within arm's reach. He'd lived long enough to know that panic was a luxury. You could afford it only when you had people to rescue you afterward. Walter didn't. Rex lifted his head at the flicker, then relaxed again when Walter didn't react. The dog had learned his cues from the man, and the man had learned his steadiness from surviving men who didn't have any. Outside, the blizzard built its voice. The wind slammed into the cabin in waves, and each wave felt stronger than the last. Like Lake Superior was sending the storm in pulses, testing the town's resolve. Walter fed the first log into the fireplace and watched it catch quickly, flames licking the wood with hunger. The room warmed slowly, not enough to feel comfortable, but enough to feel alive. Walter sat in the worn armchair facing the fire, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the flame. He wasn't thinking about heroism. He wasn't thinking about the neighbors. He was thinking about the next 12 hours. He was thinking about how cold could turn into desperation faster than people believed. In war, men broke down from fear. In winter, men broke down from boredom, hunger, and the quiet realization that no one was coming. Sometime after 9, Rex's head snapped up. His ears angled toward the porch, and his low growl rolled out like distant thunder. Walter stood immediately, body moving before thought. He grabbed the flashlight and walked to the door. Another sound followed. Muffled footsteps. Then a fist knocking against wood. Hesitant at first, then urgent. Walter didn't open the door right away. He leaned close, listening. "Who is it?" he called. "It's Gary!" a voice shouted back through the wind. "Walter, open up!" Walter unlocked the door and pulled it open only as far as the chain allowed. Snow blasted into the entryway like a living thing. Gary Whitman stood there hunched and half buried in white, his brown jacket crusted with ice, his mustache stiff and frosted, cheeks raw red from cold. His eyes were wide, not with comedy now, but with something closer to fear. "Jesus," Gary gasped, stumbling forward. "This thing came in hard. My woodpile's soaked. It's like the whole damn stack turned into a frozen sponge." Walter watched him without smugness. "Come inside," he said, unhooking the chain. Rex stood behind Walter, shoulders squared, his gaze locked on Gary as if measuring him. Gary stepped in and stamped snow off his boots, breathing hard. He looked around the cabin, noticing the steady fire, the dry warmth, the lantern ready on the table. His expression shifted part envy, part disbelief. "You're warm," he said quietly, as if the fact offended him. Walter didn't answer. He didn't need to. He handed Gary a towel without making it feel like charity. Gary wiped his face, then looked toward the fireplace like a starving man looking at bread. "My wife's freaking out," he admitted, voice dropping. "Linda's got the kids bundled up like they're going to war. I tried lighting a fire and the wood just hissed, smelled like mold. I swear I covered it. I did everything right." Walter's eyes flicked to Gary's hands. They were trembling slightly, and Walter recognized the tremor. Not just cold, shame. The shame of being helpless in front of your own family. Walter had felt that shame once, long ago when he'd come home and realized he didn't know how to be a normal man anymore. He didn't rub it in. He simply nodded toward the chair. "Sit," he said. "Warm up." Gary sat, but he didn't relax. He kept glancing toward the door, as if he might have to run back out at any moment. "You think this'll last?" he asked, gesturing vaguely at the storm. Walter stared into the fire. "Lake-effect storms can sit on you for a day," he said. "Sometimes longer." Gary swallowed. "And if the power goes?" Walter's voice stayed flat. "Then you burn wood." Gary looked at him with a strange mix of irritation and awe. "You always talk like everything's simple." Walter finally looked at him. His eyes were calm, but not cold. "It's not simple," he said. "It's prepared." Gary's gaze drifted down to the living room floor. His eyes narrowed slightly, as if he'd remembered the hole, the trapdoor, the ridiculous plan he'd laughed at. "That thing," he said, nodding at the floor. "You already got wood down there?" Walter stood and walked to the chair he'd placed over the trapdoor. Rex rose instantly too, staying close, his tail low, his body ready. Walter moved the chair aside and lifted the hidden plank. The opening revealed darkness and the faint smell of straw and stone. Walter reached down and pulled up 2 thick, dry logs. They looked clean, pale, freshly split, as if they'd been cut that morning rather than stored beneath a floor in a storm. Gary's mouth fell open. "No way," he breathed. Walter handed Gary a log. Gary took it like it was a sacred object. He pressed his thumb into the wood and blinked. "It's dry," he said, stunned. "It's actually dry." Walter's jaw tightened slightly. Not in pride, but in vindication he refused to celebrate. "Stone keeps the moisture off," he said. "Straw pulls what little damp tries to sneak in. The air stays stable down there." Gary stared at Walter like he was looking at a man who'd cheated death with a trick no one else knew. "You planned this," he whispered. Walter didn't deny it. "I've seen what happens when you don't," he said. Gary sat back, holding the log across his knees, and for a moment he looked smaller than he had earlier. "Linda's gonna kill me," he muttered. "I told her tarps were enough." Walter almost smiled again, a thin shadow of humor. "Tarps are good for summer rain," he said. "Not for Superior." Gary let out a shaky laugh, the kind people make when they realize the joke was on them. "You got any extra?" he asked, and his voice cracked on the last word. Walter stared at him. This was the moment the town always reached eventually. The moment when pride gave way to need. Walter could have said no. He could have watched Gary stumble back into the storm and told himself it wasn't his responsibility. That was what loneliness did. It convinced you that refusing help was the same thing as being strong. But Walter's strength had never been about refusing. It had always been about enduring. Enduring meant understanding that survival wasn't a solo sport forever. Walter reached down again and pulled up more logs, stacking them in Gary's arms until Gary looked like a man carrying his own redemption. Rex watched closely, not hostile, but protective, as if he understood the value of what Walter was giving away. Gary's eyes watered and he pretended it was the wind. "I'll pay you," he said quickly. Walter cut him off. "Just keep your kids warm," he said. Gary nodded hard, swallowing. "Thank you," he said, and the words came out heavy, like they cost him something. Before Gary left, another knock came, fainter, almost swallowed by the storm. Walter's eyes narrowed. Rex growled again, deeper this time. Walter opened the door and found Marlene Jacobs standing there, bundled in her puffy blue coat, her silver hair hidden under her hat, her cheeks flushed bright pink. She held a plastic bin in her arms, and her mouth was set in a stubborn line. "Don't you say it," she called over the wind, eyes flicking to Walter's face. "Don't you even look smug." Walter stepped aside. "Come in," he said. Marlene stomped snow off her boots and set the bin down. "My wood's a disaster," she announced, as if confessing a crime. "It's wet. It's frozen. It smells like the inside of a swamp. I tried lighting it, and I nearly smoked myself to death." She glared at Walter. "So, I'm here, like a fool." Walter looked at her, then at Gary, who was still holding an armful of dry logs like a child clutching presents. The absurdity of it all flickered through Walter's mind, and for the first time in a long while, something warm moved through him that wasn't just heat from the fire. Not happiness, not peace, but a grim kind of satisfaction. Winter had arrived, and the talking had stopped. Now there was only the truth. Walter lifted the trapdoor again and reached down, pulling up more wood. Marlene watched, her eyes widening. "Well, I'll be damned," she muttered. "You really did build a bunker for firewood." Walter handed her a few logs. "It's not a bunker," he said. "It's a plan." Marlene snorted. "Same thing?" she replied, then softened slightly. "You all right, Walter? You got enough for yourself?" Walter looked down at the pit, at the carefully stored supply he'd worked so hard to protect. He thought of the storm outside, of the long night ahead, of how quickly kindness could drain your own reserves if you weren't careful. Then he looked at Rex, who sat near the hearth watching him with unwavering loyalty, and Walter felt that stubborn resolve rise again. "I have enough," he said. Gary shifted his weight, preparing to leave. "I'll be back," he said, voice thick. "When the road's clear, I'll make this right." Walter nodded once. "Just go," he said, "before the wind decides you belong out there." Gary hurried into the storm with his bundle of dry wood, disappearing almost instantly into the white. Marlene hugged her logs to her chest and followed, her shoulders squared like she was marching into battle. Walter closed the door behind them and leaned his forehead briefly against the wood. His breath came out slow. The cabin was warm, but his chest felt heavy, not from fear, but from the strange weight of being needed. He hadn't been needed in a long time. It was a dangerous feeling. It could make you careless. It could make you hope. Rex walked over and pressed his head against Walter's thigh. Walter rested his hand on the dog's neck, fingers sinking into thick fur. "We're all right," Walter murmured, though he wasn't sure if he meant the dog or himself. Outside, the storm raged like an old god throwing a tantrum. Inside, the fire held steady, fed by dry wood that had been laughed at yesterday and prayed for tonight. Walter returned to the hearth and added another log, watching the flames catch instantly. He listened to the crackle, to the steady breathing of Rex, to the cabin holding firm against the wind. And for the first time since arriving in Duluth, Walter allowed himself one quiet thought. Maybe he hadn't come here just to survive winter. Maybe he'd come here to remember how to belong to the living. Morning didn't bring relief. It brought a deeper kind of cold, the kind that made the air inside the cabin feel thinner, sharper, like the world had decided warmth was a privilege it no longer offered. Walter woke before dawn to a silence so heavy it sounded loud. The wind had eased for a few minutes. but the snow outside had stacked itself into walls, and the trees stood frozen mid-bough, as if they'd been caught praying. Rex rose the moment Walter's boots hit the floor, his body stretching with controlled readiness, not lazy, not playful. He padded to the window and stared out, nose twitching. Walter followed and saw what the night had done. The porch steps were nearly buried, the road was erased, and the sky looked like a sealed lid over the town. Walter's breath fogged the glass. He turned toward the lamp on the table and clicked it on. Nothing. He clicked again. Still nothing. The power had finally gone, and in Duluth, that wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a countdown. Walter didn't panic. He moved the way he always moved when something broke. Calm, deliberate, slightly faster than normal. He lit the lantern, its small flame casting a soft amber glow that made the cabin feel older, like a memory of a different century. The furnace stayed dead. The refrigerator hummed no more. The house was suddenly reduced to the most honest kind of living fire: food, breath. Walter knelt by the fireplace, fed in dry wood from his hidden stash, and watched the flames rise with a clean, eager sound. He held his hands near the heat and felt his joints loosen slightly. The storm hadn't beaten him. Not yet. Rex lay down near the hearth again, his thick fur catching the firelight, eyes half-lidded but alert. Walter studied the dog's face and saw the same steadiness he'd relied on all night. Some creatures were built to endure. Others were built to complain. Walter had lived long enough to know the difference. By mid-morning, the first knock came. Not Gary, not Marlene. Someone new. Walter heard it through the walls, soft at first, then harder, more desperate. Rex rose with a low rumble in his chest, not aggressive but warning. Walter opened the door and found a young man standing on the porch, shoulders hunched, hair dusted with snow like powdered sugar. He looked no older than 24, with a thin face and sharp cheekbones that made him seem even younger. His skin was pale from cold, lips slightly blue, and his hands were bare, trembling. He wore a cheap gray hoodie under a thin jacket that wasn't meant for this kind of weather. His eyes were wide, not with boldness, but with the fear of someone who had made too many mistakes too quickly. "Mr. Thompson?" he asked, voice cracking. They said you had fire." Walter didn't step aside yet. "Who's they?" he asked. The young man swallowed. Gary Whitman. I'm Ethan Cole." He wiped his nose with the back of his wrist, embarrassed by the motion. "I live in the rental down by the old lot. I didn't know what to do, my pipes froze. I tried to run a space heater, but..." His voice dropped, ashamed. "No power." Walter studied him. Ethan looked like the kind of kid who'd grown up with screens and fast food and never had to learn what cold could do to a body. He wasn't weak by choice. He was simply untrained. Walter knew that type too. He'd been that once before life stripped away comfort, like paint in a storm. Rex stepped closer to Walter's leg, eyes fixed on Ethan, reading him. Ethan's gaze flicked to the dog and back to Walter, and Walter could see him calculating whether he should run. "You got family?" Walter asked. Ethan shook his head quickly. "No, sir. Just me." He hesitated, then admitted, "And a cat." Walter's eyebrows lifted slightly. "A cat?" Ethan nodded, relief flashing across his face as if the confession made him more human. "Her name's Poppy. She's small, orange. She keeps trying to crawl under the blankets." He gave a weak laugh that sounded like it hurt. "I know it sounds stupid. It doesn't, Walter said, and he meant it. Where is she now? Ethan's eyes darted toward the street. In the house, I wrapped her in a towel. I didn't want to leave her, but I didn't know what else to do. His voice broke. I can't get warm. Walter looked past Ethan at the white world, the snowdrifts swallowing fences, the sky holding the town down like a hand. He could have told Ethan to go to a shelter, if any were open. He could have said he wasn't responsible. But something in Ethan's face reminded Walter of young soldiers who'd tried to hide fear behind jokes, who'd stood in freezing rain pretending they were fine because pride was the only coat they had. Walter stepped back. "Come in," he said, "but wipe your boots." Ethan stumbled inside, eyes widening at the warmth, the lantern light, the steady crackle of fire. He stared at the hearth like it was a miracle. Rex circled him once, sniffed, then sat down, watching. Ethan sank into the nearest chair, hands stretched toward the heat, and his shoulders began to shake not from cold now, but from the release of it. Walter didn't comment. He simply handed him a mug of warm water with a spoonful of sugar. It wasn't coffee, but it was energy. "Drink," Walter said. Ethan obeyed like a man receiving orders he was grateful for. "You said you have a cat," Walter continued, voice steady. "If she's alone, she needs to be brought here." Ethan blinked. "You'd let—" Walter cut him off with a look. "I didn't say I liked cats," he said. "I said bring her." Ethan nodded fast, wiping his face. "Yes, sir. I'll go now." He stood, but Rex's head lifted, ears sharp. The wind outside had shifted again, and through the cabin walls came the faint sound of another knock, this one louder, heavier, more urgent. Walter opened the door and saw two figures in the blowing snow, a woman and a boy. The woman was in her mid-30s, tall and wiry, with dark hair pulled into a tight braid that fell over her shoulder. Her skin was brown, weathered not by age but by exhaustion, and her eyes were fierce, the eyes of someone who had learned to fight quietly for every scrap of stability. She wore a green parka that looked too thin for Duluth's cruelty, and she held a boy close to her side. The boy was around 8, small for his age, cheeks chapped raw, eyes red-rimmed from cold and crying. He clutched a stuffed dinosaur in one mittened hand, its fabric damp and sagging. The woman's lips were pressed into a straight line, as if she refused to let desperation make her beg. Walter recognized her immediately as someone new to the neighborhood, someone the town would call that single mom, with the same careless tone people used to label storms and inconveniences. "Can I help you?" Walter asked, though he already knew the answer. The woman's voice came out firm. "My name is Rosa Martinez," she said. "I live over on East 4th. We lost power. The apartment's freezing." She glanced down at the boy. "This is Mateo." Mateo didn't speak. He stared at Rex with wide eyes, half afraid, half fascinated. Walter opened the door wider. "Come inside," he said. Rosa hesitated, pride wrestling with need. Then another gust hit, and she made the decision with a sharp inhale. She stepped in, pulling Mateo with her. Rex stood, walked forward slowly, then sat a few feet away, calm but watchful. Mateo's eyes followed the dog, and for the first time, something like wonder softened his face. "Is he a wolf?" the boy whispered. Rex's ears twitched. Walter answered without humor. "No, he's a German shepherd." Then, after a pause, he added, "But he'll keep you safe." Rosa's gaze flicked to Walter's flannel jacket, to the quiet way he held himself. "People said you had firewood." she said, and the words sounded like a rumor she hadn't wanted to believe. They said you were helping. Walter looked at the fire. I'm keeping people from freezing, he said. That's all. Rosa nodded slowly, eyes shining, but refusing to spill. Thank you, she said, voice low. As the day dragged on, the cabin filled in a way Walter hadn't expected. Gary returned briefly, face drawn, bringing news that the roads were impassable and the town's emergency lines were overwhelmed. Marlene stopped by again, cheeks flushed, dropping off a pot of soup she'd managed to heat on her gas stove, her stubborn kindness disguised as irritation. Ethan came back with Poppy wrapped in a towel, a tiny orange cat with bright green eyes and a scruffy tail, shivering but alive. Poppy immediately wriggled free, sniffed the air, then marched toward the fireplace with the confidence of a creature that believed warmth belonged to her by divine right. Rex watched her with deep suspicion, head tilted, as if he couldn't understand why such a small animal moved like a queen. Mateo giggled for the first time, the sound thin but real. Rosa's shoulders loosened slightly when she heard it, and Walter felt something twist in his chest, unfamiliar and sharp. It wasn't pain. It was the memory of what it felt like to be in a room where life still happened. Walter rationed the firewood carefully, feeding the flames with discipline, not greed. He opened the trapdoor only when necessary, keeping the heat in the pit stable, protecting the rest of his supply. He didn't lecture anyone. He didn't say, "I told you so." The storm outside had already said it for him. The people who had laughed were no longer laughing. They were sitting quietly, wrapped in blankets, listening to the fire crackle like a small god speaking in a language older than pride. At one point, Rosa stood near the window, staring out at the white world. "This city," she murmured, almost to herself, "it doesn't forgive you." Walter heard her, and something in him answered. "No," he said, "but it teaches you." Rosa looked at him, studying his face. "What did it teach you?" she asked. Walter's eyes drifted to Rex, then to the fire, then to the gathered strangers turned temporary family in his small living room. His voice came out quieter than before. "That you can't outtalk winter," he said. "You can only outlast it." As night fell again, the wind howled harder, as if offended by the warmth inside Walter's cabin. But the cabin held, the fire held. Rex lay near the door, guarding. Poppy curled on a blanket close to the hearth, purring softly like a tiny engine. Mateo slept with his dinosaur clutched against his chest. Rosa sitting nearby with her back straight, refusing to fully relax. Ethan dozed in the chair, face turned toward the heat, looking less like a frightened boy and more like someone who might survive. Walter sat in his armchair, eyes on the flames, and felt the weight of the day settle over him. He had given away wood, given away warmth, given away space. Yet he didn't feel depleted. He felt, in a strange way, steadier, like the storm had carved something out of him and filled it with something else. Outside, Duluth froze in silence. Inside, Walter Thompson's cabin became the one place in the neighborhood where laughter had died, and something more honest had taken its place. The storm didn't end with drama. It ended the way exhaustion ends a fight, slowly, grudgingly, as if the blizzard itself had run out of rage. The wind softened first, dropping from a howl to a steady hiss, and then the snow stopped falling in sheets and began drifting down in lazy flakes, almost gentle, almost apologetic. Morning light returned in a pale, watery way, and Duluth looked like a town trapped inside a glass globe Someone had shaken too hard. Walter stood on his porch in his thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket, the same jacket that had watched him work and sweat and ration warmth, and he studied the world in front of him. Snowbanks rose higher than fence posts. Cars were half buried like forgotten toys. The trees glittered with ice that caught the weak sun and flashed like broken jewelry. Rex stepped beside him, breath steaming, ears alert, and for a moment the dog's body leaned forward, as if he wanted to charge into the white world and test whether it was safe again. Walter rested a hand on Rex's neck, fingers pressing into the thick fur, and felt the dog steady under his touch. "Easy," Walter murmured. "Not yet." Inside the cabin, the air still carried the smell of smoke and soup and damp wool drying by the hearth. The night before had been long, full of quiet shifts in the room. Rosa dozing upright in a chair like she was guarding her son even in sleep. Ethan curled awkwardly with his hoodie pulled over his head. Marlene muttering in her sleep as if still arguing with the weather. Poppy, the orange cat, purring like she owned the fire. And Mateo sprawled on the floor with his stuffed dinosaur pressed to his cheek, finally warm enough to let his body relax. Walter had stayed awake longer than he should have, feeding the fire with careful discipline, listening to the wind, listening to the fragile rhythm of strangers breathing in his living room. It had felt strange, like being responsible for a small piece of the world again. In the army, responsibility had been heavy but clear. In civilian life, it was messy and emotional and full of the kind of gratitude that made Walter uncomfortable. When the first real daylight came, people began to stir. Rosa rose and immediately checked Mateo's forehead with the back of her hand, her braid slightly loosened, dark hair escaping in wisps around her face. In the softer light, Walter could see more of her exhaustion-fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the tension in her jaw that never fully left, the way her hands stayed busy as if still trying to control something invisible. She looked like a woman who had learned to be tough because no one else was going to volunteer. Ethan woke next, blinking at the room like he couldn't believe he'd survived the night. His face looked less pale now, lips less blue, but his eyes still carried that raw fear of someone realizing how close he'd been to disaster. Marlene stood up and stretched her back with a grimace, then looked around the cabin with a reluctant kind of respect. "Well," she said, voice rough, "I'll admit it. This beats freezing to death in my living room." Poppy yawned and hopped onto the arm of Walter's chair like she'd been invited. Rex stared at her with offended dignity, then looked away as if refusing to acknowledge her authority. Walter didn't make breakfast like a host. He made it like a man in a survival situation. Oatmeal, hot water, whatever could be stretched. He offered bowls without ceremony. Mateo ate quietly, cheeks still pink, eyes occasionally drifting to Rex with the fascination children had for powerful animals. At one point, the boy shuffled closer and held out his dinosaur as if introducing it. "This is Thunder," he whispered to Rex. Rex sniffed the toy once and then sat down, solemn and still, accepting the introduction like a soldier receiving a salute. Mateo's face brightened, and Rosa's expression softened just enough to reveal the mother underneath the fighter. Around late morning, there was movement outside. Distant engines, the faint grind of plows. Duluth, bruised but alive, was beginning to dig itself out. Gary Whitman returned first, pushing through the snow with a shovel slung over his shoulder like a flag of surrender. His face was less panicked now but still humbled, and his mustache dripped meltwater as he stepped onto Walter's porch. "Road's clearing," Gary announced. as if delivering a report. Then he hesitated, his eyes flicking to the living room where people were gathered, and his voice dropped. "Walter, you did good. You really did." Walter didn't respond with gratitude. He simply nodded once, the way men nod when they don't trust praise. Gary cleared his throat, uncomfortable with his own sincerity. "Linda wants to thank you," he added. She's making a list of what we owe you." Walter's eyes narrowed slightly. "Nobody owes me anything," he said. Gary opened his mouth, then closed it again, realizing argument would be pointless. He glanced at the trapdoor area, now covered again, the floor restored to something close to normal. "People are talking," Gary said carefully. Walter's jaw tightened. "They always do." "Not like before," Gary replied, not laughing. That was the first time Walter felt the shift in the neighborhood. The laughter had been easy when the danger was theoretical. It was always easy to mock a man's preparations when your own comfort felt permanent. But winter had made fools of everyone equally, and in that equality, Walter's quiet plan had become something else. Proof. Not that he was better, but that he had been paying attention when others were coasting. As the day warmed slightly, still far below, comfortable, but no longer murderous, people began to leave the cabin one by one. Rosa packed Mateo's scarf tighter, her movements careful and protective. She stood near the door and looked at Walter as if searching for the right words she wasn't used to saying. "I don't know what would have happened," she said softly, "if we stayed in that apartment." She stopped, swallowed, and then added with blunt honesty, "Thank you." Walter nodded again, the only response he could offer without feeling exposed. Rosa hesitated, then glanced at Rex. "He's a good dog," she said. Rex, as if understanding, lifted his head and looked at her with calm seriousness. Walter's voice was quiet. "He saved me too," he said, and it was the closest thing to a confession he'd allowed himself in years. Ethan lingered longer than the others, hovering near the hearth like he was afraid warmth might disappear if he stepped away. His hair was messy, his cheeks still flushed, and he held Poppy in his arms, the orange cat tucked against his chest like a fragile ember. "I'm sorry," Ethan said suddenly, voice tight, "for showing up like that. I didn't know what I was doing. I thought I could handle it. I thought winter was just snow." He gave a bitter little laugh. "I didn't know it could actually kill you." Walter studied him. He saw himself in the boy, not in age, but in that moment of realization. When you learn the world doesn't care what you believed. Walter's voice came out steady, not cruel. "Now you know," he said. "Knowing is half of surviving." Ethan nodded hard. "I'm gonna do better," he promised, and the promise sounded less like bravado and more like a vow. He looked down at Poppy. For her too. Marlene was the last to go. She stood in the doorway, bundled up again, silver hair peeking from her hat, her eyes sharp but softened by something that looked suspiciously like respect. "You're gonna make the rest of us look bad," she said, trying to hide gratitude under sarcasm. "Next thing you know, people will start thinking ahead." Walter's mouth twitched. "Wouldn't that be tragic?" he replied. Marlene snorted and stepped out into the snow. Before she left the porch, she turned back and pointed a gloved finger at him. "You keep that trapdoor safe," she warned. "I don't want to hear you fell into your own genius and died." Walter gave her a flat look. "Noted," he said. When the cabin finally emptied, the silence returned. But it wasn't the same silence as before. It wasn't lonely. It was simply quiet, like a room after prayer. Walter walked across the living room and knelt at the center of the floor. He ran his hand along the seam where the trapdoor blended into the boards, feeling for gaps, for looseness. The wood was solid. The hinges were hidden. He tightened the screws, checked the latch, and then placed the rug back over it with careful precision. The trapdoor wasn't a trick anymore. It was part of the cabin, part of his strategy, part of the story the neighborhood would now whisper about. He didn't love that. He didn't want to be a legend. Legends attracted attention, and attention invited disappointment. But he couldn't erase what had happened. Winter had witnessed it. Outside, the neighborhood began to move again. Shovels scraped. People called out to each other across snowbanks. A distant laugh floated on the airlighter this time, not mocking, but relieved. Walter stepped onto the porch with Rex and looked down the street. Gary was helping another neighbor dig out a car. Rosa and Mateo moved carefully along the sidewalk, Rosa's arm wrapped protectively around her son. Ethan struggled through the snow with a shovel, stopping to catch his breath, then continuing anyway. Marlene stood on her porch, waving a ladle like a weapon, shouting at someone to bring her more salt. Duluth was bruised, but it was alive, and in its own stubborn way, it was learning. Walter took a slow breath and felt something loosen in his chest. He hadn't come to Duluth to be part of anything. He'd come to disappear. But winter had a cruel sense of humor. It didn't let him disappear. It pulled him into the center of a small community and forced him to matter again. Walter looked down at Rex, whose amber eyes watched the street with steady calm. "You ready?" Walter asked quietly. Rex's tail flicked once, subtle, like a yes. Walter stepped off the porch and onto the packed snow. The cold bit at his face, but it no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like a fact. He and Rex walked slowly down the road, boots crunching, breath steaming, moving through a world that had been scrubbed clean by storm. People glanced up as they passed. Some nodded. Some looked away, embarrassed by their earlier laughter. One man lifted a hand in greeting, awkward but sincere. Walter didn't smile. He didn't need to. He simply nodded back, acknowledging the new shape of things. As they walked, Walter thought about the trapdoor under his floor, about the stone lining and straw and dry wood hidden like treasure. He thought about how close everyone had come to freezing, how thin the line had been between comfort and catastrophe. And he thought about the lesson winter always left behind, carved into the town like a scar. Preparation wasn't paranoia. It was respect for the season, for the lake, for the fragile bodies trying to live through it. Duluth would forget again someday, because people always forgot when spring arrived and the sun made them arrogant. But this year, at least for a while, no one would laugh at strange solutions. They'd seen what happened when winter asked for proof. Walter and Rex continued down the snow-covered road, the veteran in his red and black flannel and the shepherd at his side, moving like two old guardians of a hard-earned truth. The storm had passed, but the lesson stayed, quiet and heavy, resting in the hearts of the people who had knocked on Walter Thompson's door when laughter finally ran out. Sometimes the miracle isn't a voice from the sky or a door opening on its own. Sometimes the miracle is quieter than that. Sometimes it looks like an old veteran in a red and black flannel jacket, doing the hard work when nobody is watching. Sometimes it looks like a loyal German shepherd standing guard while the world laughs until the storm proves who was wise. And maybe that's how God moves most often. not with thunder, but with small acts of preparation, courage, and love that keep people alive long enough to see another morning. Because in everyday life, we all face our own winters, not always made of snow and ice, but of loneliness, sickness, fear, bills, heartbreak, and nights when the world feels too heavy. And just like Walter's trapdoor, the blessings that save us are often the ones we built quietly. A habit of faith, a kind word, a little patience, a prayer whispered when no one hears it. God doesn't always remove the storm, but He will give you the strength, the wisdom, and the warmth to endure it. So if this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who might need hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us what winter you've survived and what kept your fire burning when everything else froze. And don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next story. May God bless you, protect your home, and keep your heart warm through every season. And may the Lord watch over you and everyone you love today, tonight, and always. Amen.